Hello, this is my first video on this account. Still don't know what I'm going to call it, but today is the birth of a new channel in the world, a channel that will probably destroy all of civilization and be the best thing that's ever happened to anyone ever. This account's main focus is using my background in behavioral neuroscience to answer silly questions that I might just come up with at any day, or maybe tackling, like a trending topic that we might see in the media. I have my own ideas that aren't necessarily consensus, and I will never try to pose my idea as the one right way to look at something. I'll instead use this channel to basically show what I think is happening in these things and also show evidence that's leading me to that. And hopefully along the way, I can make it easy to learn stuff about behavioral science and neuroscience in general, or just research. My goal essentially is to make science more fun for people, kind of point out how common scientific talk is, even more common than we might think. For example, like, oh, why can't I stop eating? Why do I have such a hard time quitting alcohol? Why do I want love? Stuff like that. Anything like that you can answer with science and behavioral research, and it's really cool. So in our first video today, we're going to be looking at a list that my friends have actually compiled while we were hanging out together, just on some chill shit, like 15, 16, 17 questions that they have about behavior. Basically how it was made is I was hanging out with my friends because I'm home for winter break right now, and we just kind of started to drink, and then I just passed around this notebook and said, write whatever you want and I'll try to answer it to the best of my ability. So just for intro, I'm an undergrad student in my last semester. I'm going into my last semester, so I'm a senior. I go to a good research university, and I study behavioral neuroscience. Behavior has been something that's been really important to my life and something I've always had a lot of interest in, since I was very young. I wasn't necessarily always interested in science, but I got really into watching very obscure and abnormal videos on YouTube and having a lot of fun watching those. For example, like Joey's World Tour, Shoe Nice, people just crashing out. A big thing I liked was Fuzi's 2017 whatever Drake concert. Nikocado, Avocado, all those people kind of made me question why. Like, why are they doing that? And after getting into college and learning about stuff from an evolutionary standpoint, I could kind of understand why. And it made me realize that we could give like compelling answers to questions like this for really stupid behaviors. So I just want to do that to the best of my ability. And I found that doing that made science a lot of fun for me. And it made me very passionate about learning more about organisms. And I think I can ignite a lot of passion for a lot of people, or help them, discover something that they're interested in that they may have not ever looked into. Because neuroscience is kind of niche, you won't really learn anything about it in high school, nor will you in college unless you're specifically studying it. So I feel like channels like this are important to kind of get the word out there because it is such a fun field. So the first question we're going to be answering is this one right here. I hope it's showing. I can't really see. It's why do people jork it? Obviously that was an attempt of being funny, saying jork it instead of jerk it. Jork it is also a commonly used phrase now among teenagers and young adults. But, essentially, why do people jerk off? So the first thing I think of when I hear that question is like positive reinforcement, something that is giving you some sort of feedback that then makes you want to do it again. In the case of masturbation, this would be the pleasure you feel from actually like touching yourself. It feels good, so I want to do it again. But then you start to get the question of, well, one, why does it feel good? And two, why is it beneficial for you to do it again? Why would your body want you to do this again? Because, if you look at just how our body responds to things in general, we respond good to good things and bad to bad things. Like things that smell bad, things that are rotten. It's bad if we ate those things because our body's going to have this horrible reaction and we're going to get sick afterwards and all this other stuff. And it smells bad because of that. Same thing with like pain. You're going to stop doing shit and everything that hurts is bad for you. But it's not exactly like trash or rotten food is objectively bad for everything ever, because if you look at animals that literally live off of that, I bet to them it smells very good, and it doesn't smell repulsive, and it doesn't make them puke when they eat it and stuff like that. It's just that our own bodies as species has developed in different ways to specialize us for different things and kind of lead us to different behaviors. So, you start to think, okay, well, what's the utility of masturbation? Well, one utility could be that it kind of helps you learn sex in a way. Like, for example, I know it's a common thing that happens to a lot of people when they're young. Like, they might just be like doing whatever with their hands, and then they end up like accidentally touch themselves, and they're like, oh, this feels good. And then they kind of do it again. That sort of looking at your genitalia and working with it, the more you kind of touch it, the more you understand what feels good or doesn't feel good. And then you just kind of do it. And then that kind of gives you a simulation of what sex is. And it kind of helps as a stencil in that way because, well, as organisms, one thing that's always going to be a huge driving, motivating factor for us is pushing on our genes and reproducing and getting to the next generation, basically. And, that's for a lot of reasons that we can get into in a second. But because of that, as animals, we want to have sex. But, when you're born, you're not really born with a pamphlet of, oh, this is how you have sex. This is how you move on your genes to the next generation. So things like masturbation can act as like a stencil or a blueprint that kind of get you learning to interact with that part of your body and understanding its utility outside of just, like urinating. You're like, oh, it's like a pleasure point. And then it could just up your chances of interacting with it later in the way that allows you to have kids. This fixation towards genitalia isn't something that's purely human either. We see this in a lot of animals. For example, I know just off the top of my head, like dogs and cats, we know they're always licking their ass and like balls and shit like that. And, you would think that that's pleasurable to them in some way. I'll do research and put it up in one of the corners if it is or not. But you'd think it's pleasurable for them in some way. And the reason why it is you would also imagine to kind of teach them to interact with those parts of their body. Something that is interesting, though, is you start to think about, well, dogs and cats are pets. They get castrated. They get neutered. Well, why would they still do that if they can't have kids anymore? And to that, I would say, even though they're unable to reproduce, their shaft is still going to be there. Parts of their body that can still interpret pleasure and stuff are still going to be around, so they'll still feel it. It just won't have that utility. It's almost like masturbation is a mechanism that's like a means to an end of reproduction. And if you take away the end, the means is still there. So the animals will still interact with themselves in that way. So that could answer maybe why people do jork it. In general, why animals and everything jorks it. But the question can also be asked, well, like, why? Well, you can bridge off to a couple different things. One, you could say, well, humans, we know we're not going to have kids by jerking off. So why do we jerk off? Like other animals, when they do it, they just feel good and yada, yada, yada. They don't really think about the implications of kids. But we know that if we like jerk off and then nut somewhere, this won't result in kids. So this isn't really a beneficial activity for us. It might be actually detrimental because it takes away a lot of energy and focus that we could be using on a lot of other stuff. Well, and for one, I think that is an interesting argument, and I think that holds some weight to it. But again, like even if we know that it isn't going to result in kids, just knowing that it feels good in the first place and learning that feels good can then increase your desire to actually want to have like real sex and actually interact with other people with those parts of your body in the future. And maybe if you hadn't ever masturbated before or, didn't feel anything in your genitals, you would never want to do that with other people in the future. So even though it isn't being used all the time, again, it's for the end, at the end probably. But who knows? Another thing I would say is that in evolution, the whole idea is that we all stem from common ancestors, and, humans are mammals. And if you look at like mammals in general, all mammals stem from the last common ancestor that they all shared, and then they bridged off into their own species and stuff like this. And you could say that, since evolution works in a way to where it kind of develops and builds on stuff over time, like builds and shaves stuff off and whatever, you don't really start over every generation. You kind of build upon things and stuff like that. So like if this is present day, and then this is when eukaryotes started. If you go like here, you'll get like things starting to walk on land. Here you'll get some sort of complexity that's more complex than here. So it's just like building on each other. And if we have these like ancestral, super deep motivations of wanting to interact with ourselves like this, you could say that just wanting to masturbate and having an inclination to masturbating would be like almost like a strong primal instinctive reaction that we have that may have not gone away just because we developed consciousness and like sense of self and like understanding of the utility of behaviors. The feelings of masturbation might be so well conserved that they just aren't going away. There's just nothing that's taking it away. But I don't know. Those are just some ideas. Also, another thing I want to touch on is, like I was saying, every species is going to have a large want to reproduce. And the reason this is simply because the only people in the next generations are going to be born from people who had sex. So everybody's going to have this set of like genes that have like a desire to have kids, if that makes sense. So like if you take all the animals in every species off of the face of the earth, and you only have 20 animals of like some new, alien species on Earth, and let's call them cups for some reason, and there's 20 of these cups, and they're just chilling on Earth, and they don't really care, they're living. But let's say that reproducing and having kids isn't really a popular behavior among this new species of cups. And so only 6 of the cups mate with each other and then have kids. Well, even though there's 20 cups that were still able to survive and not necessarily have anything, wrong with them without having kids, eventually they will die with age. And the only cups that will be there left are the kids of the 6 cups. Since those 6 cups all had intercourse with each other and then reproduced, all of their kids are going to have instinctive genetic coding that's going to in some ways garner them towards wanting to reproduce. So it's not like evolution is directly making people want to reproduce. It's more that the only people that can move on are people who have genetic ties to reproducing. And if someone is reproducing more and more and more and more and more, they're going to have more of a representation in the next generations. So that behavior is going to be very strong and you're going to want to reproduce. That's like the most fundamental behavior pushing on generations, basically. I feel like those 2 answers are pretty sufficeable as to why people may jerk off or what may have caused people to start jerking off or what's the utility behind it. But, I feel like this question was probably also involved with like, why do people jerk off over and over again? Why do people keep jerking off? And in my opinion, what's most likely responsible for that is dopamine in the brain. Dopamine is a very big buzzword almost in today's society. No, but dopamine's kind of become like a buzzword where a lot of people don't actually know what it does or like what dopamine even necessarily means. I've seen a lot of very interesting videos on TikTok and Instagram Reels where they'll say some very ignorant things about dopamine, which shows me that they don't really know what they're talking about, but then they're spreading this as information and then like other people are interacting with it and learning from that, but they're not really learning anything because it's mischaracterizing dopamine. Dopamine's involved in a lot of different behaviors and it is involved in a lot of different functions in the body, but how it's relevant to jerking off is its motivational properties. Dopamine's just kind of been observed to help people create learned compulsions towards things and things that are rewarding specifically. So for example, you could see how jerking off would be rewarding because it feels really good when you do it and you also come. And on top of this, we've also seen in studies that when people have sex, they're releasing higher levels of dopamine. This dopamine that's getting released, it's basically in your mesolimbic structures. Maybe that's relevant, maybe it's not. But we're going to be talking about it a lot through this channel, so I'll just put up a picture of it. Your mesolimbic dopamine pathways. This is just kind of like the main area that's going to be involved in reward processing and reward learning and just invoking people to act in reward-seeking behaviors in general, which is kind of the basis of why people say dopamine is so involved in things like addiction and watching things like porn and motivation and stuff like that in general. Most likely when you jerk off, you're also releasing dopamine in the same way that dopamine is released when you have sex. But most famously, it influences reward-seeking behaviors and it increases your want for rewards. Things that are rewarding release the trigger of dopamine. And then after you learn associations to that reward, the actual associative cues can trigger dopamine on its own, which it causes you to then seek out the reward. If you want to take a real life example for this, think of Pavlovian conditioning. If you don't know what Pavlovian conditioning is, basically the scientist Ivan Pavlov would do this experiment where he would ring a bell and then he would give a dog food. And then he kept giving this dog the same test over and over. And eventually the dog kind of learned that, oh, when this bell goes ding, that means that food's going to come. And so Ivan was able to ring the bell and then the dog would start salivating in anticipation for the food, even if he never ended up showing the food. So he would ring it and then give the dog the food, learned that the ring means food, And then eventually he was able to ring it without ever showing the food, and the dog would still have a physical reaction to it. And this experiment gave us huge insight into how learning works. And, when scientists were able to recreate these studies while actually looking at dopamine levels in the brain, a reward response measurement, they were able to see that when you first start testing animals in the conditions and you ring the bell and you give them the food, their dopamine levels spike after eating the food. But once they learn that association between the bell equals food, basically, their dopamine spikes when the bell is rung, but then doesn't really spike when they actually eat the food. And so then you could say that, okay, that makes sense, because when you ring the bell, it increases the dopamine in the dog's brain, and then that gets them to like, oh, where's the food? Where's the food? It gets them looking for the food. So in the same way, when you're jerking off, you're starting to feel really good, like when you jerk off. And when you come, you get that dopamine release. And most of the time, what are you watching porn on? Probably your phone or your computer or some sort of like portable device. And you could say that phone or your computer, or maybe even like Safari, becomes the bell in a way, because that is like a cue for porn. So you could look at your phone and beyond that, and then you watch porn or you jerk off enough to where you start to get dopamine spikes when you like look at your phone or where you're on Google. And it kind of creates this influence on you to make you more likely to go look up like porn or look up something you can jerk off to, and then you jerk off to it. And so you might be in this weird like circle of getting biased to jerk off because you jerked off. You know what I mean? Another way this could be happening is, let's say, just a feeling of horniness can become the cue. So instead of a bell, you feel horny and then you jerk off. So, eventually, you feel a certain way, from the learning experience you had, that touching yourself there feels good. And you start to feel a desire to want to feel good. So then you touch yourself, and then you do it enough to where you have this habit where, oh, I feel like this, I'm going to touch myself. And then theoretically, your dopamine spike would shift from actually like climaxing to just the feeling of being horny in and of itself. So you could have like a double whammy of the actual feeling of being horny, increasing your odds of jerking off, plus you looking at your phone and looking at your computer or being on Google, increasing your odds of jerking off or looking up porn, which is going to lead you to jerking off. And you could also say that's why people jerk off. Although I would say that probably the feeling is a stronger influence because, and I'm not sure about this now, but I'll look it up in a second. I'm sure jerking off was still very prevalent before online porn was a thing. It may have gone up though, and that would be interesting. So let's look into this. Yeah, I mean, as you'd expect, I couldn't find any stats on that. And even if I could, I really wouldn't trust it. But, like I was saying, I mean, hypothetically, even if it was increased, like masturbation rates were increased now, so it'd be hard to really discern like what's more important. I'm guessing, it varies person to person and how much they like one thing over another. It's also possible that some people can develop like a porn addiction, but maybe not an addiction to jerking off. Because I know that even watching porn, or I feel like, I mean, I don't really know. I mean, I'd have to look it up. I don't think there's anything on this, but I feel like watching porn would actually probably elicit dopamine too. Hold on. Okay, let's see. It says, in addition, due to the huge amount of pornographic material on the internet, repeated experience of immense number of sexually arousing objects lead to long-lasting arousing emotional experiences that decrease usual mechanisms of habituation and lead to very long periods of sexual arousal and sensitization to these stimuli. These sensitizations related to long-term sexual arousal and hyperexcitability may have negative consequences for balance between excitatory and inhibitory neural systems, and due to various neurobiological changes such as increased dopamine production and corticoid arousal, they may cause uncontrolled hypersexual behavior. Uncontrolled is kind of problematic because then you start to get into like, I can't control anything I do sexually related. No. So basically all that to say that, watching pornographic material may actually be making you more sensitive to pornographic material and these dopamine reactions that would cause you to look for it more. So the more you interact with it, the more powerful it can be in garnering your compulsions, or the more powerful it can be in driving you to actually do stuff like watching more porn or jerking off. But, the actual answer to why do we jerk off has a lot of ways to answer it. If you want to ask, why do we jerk off? Why did it develop as something? Most likely, I would say as a mechanism to get us to kind of learn and be more oriented towards sexual-esque behaviors, because we do need to do that in the future to push on our genes. And the people we came from would have had genes that made them want to have sex, so that would be passed on to us. We want to have sex. Touching ourselves could be a good tool to learning how to have sex, or at least biasing us to want to do things with our genitalia in the future, which is going to increase the odds of us having sex. And then if you're going to ask that question of wanting to know why people in the modern day might jerk off, well, you could say it feels good, so they do it. But you could also say that because of the dopamine that's released when you jerk off, this dopamine can be then attached to cues of things that you jerked off to, or mediums that you used to help you jerk off. And so when you interact with these mediums like phones or laptops, that can bias you and influence you to want to jerk off. Or you could say the feeling that you were trying to satisfy by jerking off can even become a cue to where, I have this feeling, I need to jerk off, and then you kind of build a habit. So, maybe not habit necessarily, and then it's like, it's because it's a habit, but it's just because of this learned reaction that you have inside your brain. So a mechanism for sex, or maybe a learned reaction. And the more you work with it, it's been hypothesized that the stronger this reaction becomes. And so that could also explain why, some people may be porn addicts. And obviously the people who have the hardest time quitting watching porn are the people who watch it the most. So, yep, that's question 1.